Our next speaker of the evening, I believe, also has a local congregation. He does not, okay, but he's based here. He's from South Africa originally. He has been working with the Noahide community for, I don't know how many years now, something like since the 1980s, roughly. A very long time supporter of the Noahide concept, teaching Noahides. Many of you already know of his work. Of course, he's one of the members of the Rainbow Covenant Foundation, as is one of our other speakers, Jack. And tonight he is going to deliver a message to us, which I don't have my notes in front of me, so I'll let him introduce it. But anyway, a longtime teacher of Noahides and supporter of spreading the Sheva Mitzvot, Rabbi Michael Katz.
Good evening. Good evening. It's wonderful to be here and to take this opportunity to share with you words and thoughts from our Torah. And the topic that I have chosen some time ago when Ray Patterson first asked me to speak, and he asked everyone to choose topics. So what I came up with, and I hope that it's going to be relevant, is where the Noahides are commanded for Kiddush HaShem, which is to sanctify God. You might think that the topic is hypothetical, as I explained it, but we will explore and we will see if we can find relevance in our times. But let's define our terminology. I'm going to find it very difficult not to keep using the word Kiddush HaShem. Every time I have to translate it and say sanctification of God's name, it won't work. So that term, Kiddush HaShem, is one that I'm going to use, and I'm sure most of you understand it. Kiddush, you're familiar with the term from Friday night, festival evenings. The blessing over the wine is called Kiddush. HaShem, you know, is the word that we use informally to refer to God. So this is the word that means sacred, holy, sanctified. And in our sense, we're expressing God's holiness in a public manner. Now there's a more mundane or colloquial use of the expression Kiddush HaShem. Any public act of nobility or kindness. You read in the newspaper about somebody who was motivated by his religious inspiration, and he did something wonderful. He did something kind, something generous, something noble. And the paper says that the reason why he did that is because of his religious upbringing. That's called a Kiddush HaShem. And that level of Kiddush HaShem is incumbent upon everyone in the world, Jew and non-Jew alike. For the non-Jew, it's simply a corollary of the injunction against blasphemy. If one cannot blaspheme God, then the reverse is that one must do what one can to honor God. So that level of Kiddush HaShem is for everyone, but that's not what I'm talking about tonight. What will engage our discussion tonight will be the ultimate expression of Kiddush HaShem as it is discussed in the Torah, in the Talmud, and in the codes. And that is that you give your life for God. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might, to be willing to surrender one's life for God. Leviticus chapter 22, verse 32. V'nigdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael. God says, I will be sanctified in the midst of Israel. And this is the source text in the Torah for the requirement that we sanctify God. But this particular wording is somewhat strange, and we'll come back to it. Nigdashti, I will be sanctified, b'toch, in the midst, b'nei Yisrael, of the children of Israel. It's very significant, this expression, in the midst of the children of Israel, for our purposes, and we'll come back to that later. First, what is the natural state of mind of a human being? What is more reasonable? That you're willing to give your life for God or that you're not? What should we assume? There's an amazing dialogue between God and Moses in the 19th chapter of Exodus. In preparation for the revelation at Mount Sinai, verse 12, God says to Moses, "You shall set boundaries for the people round about, saying, beware of ascending the mountain or touching its edge. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely die." Very clear. God tells Moses, warn the people. The mountain is going to achieve a much higher standing of holiness. Tell them not to come to step foot onto the mountain. It's too holy for them. They will die. Verse 21, same chapter. God says to Moses, descend, warn the people, lest they break through to HaShem to see, and a multitude of them will fall. It certainly seems that God is repeating his instructions and warning. Moses, incredibly, has the chutzpah to suggest that God is unnecessarily repeating himself. Verse 23, Moses said to God, the people cannot ascend Mount Sinai because you've already warned us, saying, bound the mountain and sanctify it. Why must I warn them again? You already have warned them. Abraham bargains with God for the people of Sodom, but this is far beyond simply bargaining with God. This is telling God, forgive me, but I think you don't need to say what you're saying. God pretty much instructs Moses to go and do as he's told. Now this is, as I said, an unprecedented piece of dialogue. The Reb Chaim ben Attar, an 18th century commentator on the Bible, on the Torah, he explains this exchange. Moses feels that the people will not dare to disobey God. God has warned them, don't come into the mountain. Of course they're going to listen. God, on the other hand, says, I know them better. They are going to be so desirous of the heightened spirituality that can be attained by touching the mountain at that moment in time when God descends upon it, that they will break through and they won't be able to hold themselves back. They won't be able to control themselves from touching the mountain. So therefore you, Moses, must warn them again and tell them I don't want them to surrender their lives. They know that they will die if they touch the mountain, but I know them. They will be willing to give their lives for that one moment of extreme spiritual achievement. Moses, go and tell them I don't want them to do that. I don't want their lives with us. They should rather be happy, be satisfied with a lesser level of holiness and not die. God formally declares this principle in Leviticus 18, verse 5. You shall observe my decrees and my laws, which man shall perform, and by which he shall live. And the Talmud in Yoma stresses, by which he shall live and not die. The Torah is given to us, the commandments are given to us to live by them and not to die by them. So if performing the commandment is going to result in our death, we don't have to do it. Now, there are exceptions to this rule. There are some sins that are so severe that one cannot continue living with the damage that is caused by these sins. We call them the cardinal sins, and they are idolatry, certain sexual sins such as adultery, and murder. The sins of sex and idolatry are derived from specific texts, whereas the exception of murder is derived from logic. And this is very significant to us as well, because the verse that exempts idolatry and the verse that exempts adultery are both found in that portion of the Torah that belongs to Israel. It does not belong to the Gentile world. But logic belongs to everyone. So the exemption for idolatry and adultery perhaps cannot extend outside of Israel, whereas the exemption for murder would. Now when I say exemption, it's kind of misleading, But I'm exempting it the reverse. By exempting it, I'm not saying, therefore, you're allowed to do it. It's therefore is not included in the principle of you shall live by it and not die by it. On these particular sins, the law is you shall die by it rather than live by it, maintaining that damage that you've already caused. Let us examine celebrated cases of Kiddush Hashem in the Bible. Samson, the first one that comes to mind, he gives his life in order to avenge the Philistines and their idolatry. King Saul, he gives his life in order to avoid a desecration of God by having his anointed one killed by the pagans. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, together with their colleague Daniel, in the lion's pit, thrown into the furnace by Nebuchadnezzar in order to avoid bowing to his idol. The problem with all these cases is, very simply, they are Jews. Samson, Saul, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, we cannot bring proofs from them for our purposes. We could perhaps look at the example of Abraham, the child Abraham, being thrown by Nimrod into the furnace. But I don't really want to, because that's based on a midrash. It's not really in the Bible itself. So let's look at two cases where the subject does not offer his or her life. And when I say his or her life, I'm not just being politically correct. I'm giving you a hint as to who I'm talking about. Who in the Bible should perhaps have offered her life and not sin, but she didn't. She went ahead and did the sin and did not offer her life. And that is Queen Esther. According to many opinions, Queen Esther was married to Mordechai, which means that she is committing adultery by living with Ahasuerus. Were she to have refrained, to have refused, she would have been killed. She chooses the road that she chose, and the Talmud is concerned, what right did she have to do that? Clearly, the sin that she's committing is one of the three cardinal sins for which one must give one's life and not commit the sin. How could she do it? A number of answers are suggested, and we'll focus now just on one of them. And that is that the Talmud wants to draw a distinction between being active and being passive. And in the case of Queen Esther, the Talmud is saying that her sin was a passive one. She was not an active participant. I guess you can figure out what it means to say. So that doesn't help us very much either. We come to one more example. And this one's the good one, because this one is not a Jew. So therefore we can really try to understand something from the particular case. I would have liked to have paused and given you some time to perhaps see if you can come up with it, but I don't think you're going to anyway. The second book of Kings, chapter 5, tells us the story of Naaman, a general in the army of the king of Aram, suffers from leprosy, comes to the prophet Elisha. Elisha tells him to bathe in the Jordan and he'll be cured. He does so. After originally not wanting to do it, he eventually does it, he's cured. He comes back to Elisha, he says, I now accept the God of Israel. There's no other God but the God of the Jews. But I'm going back. I'm going back to my job as general in the army of the king of Aram. And I have to ask a favor of you, he says to Elisha. When the king goes to the temple to worship his idol, he needs me to lean on. He leans on me. I service him in this regard. So when I come into the temple, I'm also going to have to bow down to the idol. Of course, I don't believe in the idol, and I've given up that belief, and I believe only in God, in HaShem. But I'm going to have to go through the motions. He says to Elisha, please understand that this is something that I have to do. Elisha says, Lech LaShalom, go in peace. Now, if Naaman at this point has become an observant Noahide, And we're talking here about idolatry. How can he agree to do this? You have to give your life. Talmud gives a very interesting answer, which means we'll come back now to that quote that I gave you earlier from Leviticus. V'nikdashti v'soich b'nei Yisrael, and I will be sanctified in the midst of the children of Israel. It's a strange concept, one which is not going to sit very well with all of you. But as those of you who know me from previous occasions when I've spoken, I don't run away from the controversial, and I'm not afraid to say what might not sit that well with you. The sanctification of God can only happen in the children of Israel. Naaman if he would surrender his life rather than worship that idol in the pagan temple, no Jews would know about it. Since no Jews will know about it, he doesn't have to do it. There's no Kiddush Hashem unless Jews know it happened. If no Jew will ever know that this happened, there's no Kiddush Hashem. It doesn't sit very well, I understand, but that's what the Talmud says. This is the Talmud at the end of the 8th chapter in Sanhedrin. It says that the reason why we cannot learn a proof from the story of Naaman as to whether or not a Noahide is commanded for Kiddush Hashem is because it happened privately. It did not happen publicly. Had it happened publicly, he would not have been allowed to have bowed down to that idol. Elisha would not have given him what we understand to have been a permit. The Kiddush Hashem has to happen in a congregation of Israel. Congregation is defined as a minyan, a quorum, 10 adult Jewish males. If they won't be there, there is no Kiddush Hashem, there's nothing to talk about. It doesn't matter how many Gentiles witness the act, it is still not required to refrain from transgressing the sin if a minyan of Jews does not witness it. The fact that we are reading about it afterwards doesn't make any difference. You can have a Jewish reporter there taking a photograph. He's going to write it up in the newspapers. A million of Jews will read about it in the paper the next morning. Doesn't matter. They have to witness the actual act. Otherwise, you can say about Naaman, it's written in Tanakh. We all know about it. So of course all the Jews know about it. That doesn't make any difference. It didn't happen in front of a million of Jews. Now I mentioned earlier that one answer that excused Queen Esther was that she was a passive participant in the sin. This distinction between active and passive relates to the action of the sin itself. But would this distinction hold related to the act of Kiddush Hashem? Is it only required for the individual to allow himself to be put to death in a passive manner, or must he actively bring death upon himself to avoid the forbidden transgression? In other words, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, in the book of Daniel, the soldiers of Nebuchadnezzar throw them into the furnace. What if that wasn't the scenario? What if they were required to climb into the furnace themselves? Would they then still be obligated to do that? In other words, I'm going to sit back and allow myself to be tossed into the furnace? That I have to do. But actively, do I have to do that? Is that not then going to be a violation of you shall live by it? Very interesting incident is quoted at the end of the first chapter of Talmud Kedushin. A Gentile noblewoman with powerful political connections, she entices Rabbi Tzadok to commit an act of indecency, to commit an immoral act with her. She could have him executed if he refuses. Well, Rabbi Tzadok complains to her. He says, I'm not feeling very well right now. I'm feeling rather weak. Perhaps you have something for me to eat in the house? She says, well, all I have here is this piece of non-kosher meat. He says, aye. He says, that tells you something, doesn't it? someone who's willing to commit this act deserves to eat non-kosher meat. She says, okay, I'll warm it up. She turns on the oven to start cooking the meat. He climbs into the oven. She says, what are you doing? He says, someone who's willing to commit this act with you deserves to fall into the fires of hell. She says, had I realized that you take this so seriously, I wouldn't have bothered you in the first place. That's the Talmud. I'm not making it up. So she excuses him from the deed. A similar incident is quoted about Rabbi Kahana. Again, the noblewoman, the Gentile noblewoman, entices him to commit an immoral act with her. He says, let me go and freshen up in the house. Slip into something more comfortable, perhaps. He goes onto the roof of the house, throws himself off the roof. As it so happens, Elijah the prophet comes, catches him, saves him. Elijah's not too pleased about it. He says, you know how much I had to go out of my way to come and take care of this business? But you see from these two incidents that the Talmud quotes, that one has to actively be prepared to kill oneself. He climbs into the oven. He throws himself off the roof. He doesn't say, okay, I'm leaning back. You want to kill me? Kill me. He actually works towards his own death. Now, you might wonder how any of this is really relevant. You don't imagine there's anyone is waiting for you to come home and is going to put a gun to your head and say, violate one of these Noahide transgressions, I'm going to kill you. We're not living, thank God, in a society of forced conversions. But there is a situation that could happen to any of us, a situation in which our lives might depend upon a sin. A person is dying of a fatal illness. It can only be cured or rectified by transgressing one of these cardinal sins. The Talmud, in fact, discusses a young man who's so lovesick for a married woman that he will die if he cannot have her. Talmud suggests certain options, certain alternatives. What could he do? Nothing will work. Doctors say none of that's going to work. And even if her husband's willing to divorce her so that he can marry her in order to save his life, the Talmud says that's not going to work either. Why not? Because Mayim Gnuvim Yimtaku, stolen waters are sweet. The attraction to him of this woman is the fact that she's married. If she's no longer married, the attraction won't even be there. So none of that would work. Talmud actually says he should die rather than sin with her. Perhaps the medicine that will cure a fatal illness is derived from a tree that has been worshipped as an idol. Can we now use extracts from the bark of this tree to create a medicine that might save someone? And the most likely of all the three cardinal sins, an illness which requires an organ transplant to be cured. Not too long ago, heart transplants were a novelty. From South Africa, the very first heart transplant that's where it happened. I remember all the excitement that happened at the time. But things have improved, but we still can't be that certain as to really what's going on. For the heart that is coming from the donor to be perfectly usable, it has to be as fresh as possible. We will want to get it out of the donor body very quickly, while it's still nice and warm, before it starts to deteriorate, to get it into the recipient's body. To do that, doctors are willing to redefine time of death so they can cut into the donor's body while he's still warm. Now, Jewish law doesn't necessarily go along with that. Jewish law has its own definitions of time of death. If we're going to wait for the halachic, the Jewish time of death to occur, the heart isn't going to be as useful to us any longer. So there's an urgency. There's going to be pressure on the part of the hospital, on the part of the sick person's family. Let's go with a more lenient time of death. The hospital's willing to accept this more lenient time of death, this earlier time of death. The doctors are willing to accept it. Let's do it. Why can't we do it? That way you'll get the heart out as quickly as we can, and you'll be more likely to be a successful transplant. So they see the doctors are motivated to declare what Jewish law would consider a premature time for death. Because to take even minutes away from a person who's anyway dying is murder. And say the person's dying anyway. All I'm going to do is hasten his death. So maybe he'll be dead 5 minutes sooner than he would have been dead otherwise. To take away those 5 minutes from him is murder. Just as if you took 5 years from him, if you took 50 years from him, taking 5 minutes from him is just as serious. So the recipient of the organ taken from that donor who has his body cut open before Jewish law says that he is dead, he's saving his own life at the expense of another's. Now, I said earlier that it makes a difference whether the source to exempt the cardinal sins from the obligation to live and not die by the commandments of the Torah is based on texts or logic. That one must give up one's life rather than commit certain sexual sins or idolatries based on verses in the section of the Torah that was given only to Israel. Thus, it could be argued that B'nai Noach, Noahides, are not bound to give their lives for these two sins. On the other hand, the same argument can be used to show that the injunction that we shall live by it and not die by it is also found in the section of the Torah given to Jews and not to Noahides. Therefore, Noahides should be obligated for Kiddush Hashem in all 7 of their commandments, not only sex and idolatry and murder, but all of them, even theft. And that is suggested by some commentators, by some codifiers. But let's focus for a moment then, a little more intensely, on the one that is based on logic, murder. What's the logic? Why you should not kill someone else? Why you should not commit idolatry and give your life? It's a verse, it's a pasuk. Why you should not commit adultery, give your life rather than commit adultery is also a verse. Why should you not commit murder to save your own life? That's logic. The logic is, why do you think that your life is any more important than the other person's? Someone holds a gun to your head, says, kill this other guy or I'm going to kill you. So you say, I want to kill him. Why? Who says your life's better? You want to save your own life and let him die? Maybe his life's more important than yours. You don't know that. What have you seen to make you think that your blood is any more red than the other person's blood? In other words, you have no right to save your own life at the expense of someone else's. It's logical. It doesn't need a verse. If it's logical, then it applies to everyone. It would seem that the Jerusalem Talmud, the 2nd chapter of Avodah Zarah, which supports such an assumption that a Noahide is not permitted to heal himself at the expense of someone else's life. Practically, though, it is not clear that we can derive an ultimate ruling from this piece of Talmud, because as usual, as there are different opinions among the commentators. Get 2 rabbis, you have 5 opinions. So there's a lot of source material that I've thrown at you. Is there a conclusion? That's what we always want to know. What's the bottom line? At the end of the 8th chapter of Sanhedrin, the Talmud asks Rabbi Ami, our question, are B'nai Noach commanded concerning Kiddush Hashem, giving their lives rather than transgressing any of their laws? 2 proofs are suggested, one from Queen Esther, one from Naaman that we discussed. Both are rejected. And regrettably, that is where the Talmud leaves the subject. It doesn't give an answer. Now, there are some authorities who feel that the inconclusive Talmudic discussion requires the conclusion that Noahides are required to die for Kiddush Hashem. If the Talmud asked the question and did not answer it, we take the more strict approach and say, therefore, die, rather than commit the sins. And we'll be referring to all 7 of them, not just to the 3. And this is, but others, most authorities take the more permissive viewpoint and rule that Noahides are not required. And this is as formulated in Maimonides, in the Laws of Kings, when Noahide is forced to transgress one of his laws under pain of death, he should transgress and not die, even for the sin of idolatry, because they are not commanded concerning Kiddush Hashem. But perhaps we could be justified in making a distinction between being forced under pain of death and voluntarily transgressing. So the cases that I gave that we discussed earlier about a person threatening you to take your life unless you commit the sin, that's Maimonides is saying, commit the sin, don't give your life. But where you volunteer for it, you derive benefit from the sin, such as the case we spoke of, where you require a heart transplant, and perhaps it means killing the donor sooner than he otherwise would have died so that you can get the heart as quickly as possible. I'm not so certain that we can say that that would be permitted, even for Noahides. Rabbi Yeshua Grodner, in excellent work that he writes on commentary on the Rambam called Mishpat HaMalucha, he comes to this conclusion as well, that he says that he does not believe that Noahides are permitted to heal themselves at the cost of someone else's life. I want to take a few minutes to speak about a different sort of sacrifice. Frequently, in my role on the internet and consultant to various Noahide groups, I hear the lament. There are no Noahide communities. Individuals are struggling to maintain the life of an observant Noahide when there are no like-minded people to share their lifestyle. Sound familiar? This is especially lonely for single adults and for those hoping to raise children free of the corrupting influences of their friends who do not share our values and beliefs. When Jews first came to this country, they spread into small towns in the south and in the west. They always tried to have a community around them, and they knew that they needed Jewish facilities such as a quorum of 10 adult males to say Kaddish if someone died. They needed a Jewish cemetery. They needed kosher meat. And as these communities disappeared, people started moving away into the larger cities. The remaining Jews found that their life could not be maintained as Jews. They had a choice: give it up or move. So most of them did. It was difficult. They gave up thriving businesses that they had built over generations, but they knew it's no longer viable. The business was great, but it was no longer viable to bring up Jewish children in such a community. They had loved ones buried in the cemeteries of these towns all over the south and west. They are Jewish cemeteries. It means leaving, abandoning these graves. Who knows when they could ever be visited again? This was a tremendous sacrifice for people to make, but they knew that it had to be done. There was no alternative. There will not be a viable Noahide community in this country unless those who lament their loneliness where they are living make a similar sacrifice as those Jews of a past generation. There are areas with stronger stronger Noahide presence, and these should be developed into functioning communities with appropriate services. Those living in areas that are desolate have two options. Accept that you're not going to be able to maintain your lifestyle as a Noahide, your children will not be Noahides with you, or move. But that's when I hear the lament. There's nothing in my town. I get up and move to a town where there is something. Don't keep whining, do something about it. The future's in your hands. Don't wait for others to create it for you. Do it yourself. That's the end of my formal presentation. We're already 35 minutes over the time I should have ended. But I'm happy to take questions and discussions now or later on if apparently there's going to be some kind of a free-for-all. I'll take off my jacket, roll up my sleeves, and see what happens. But I don't know how the system, how you want to work the system. If you want me to field some questions now, or just wait till afterwards.
Whatever you'd like. You want to take some questions? Please want to answer any questions for whatever.
Doug Taylor always has a question.
Actually, two.
He's becoming more Jewish even as we go along.
Going back to Naaman, did I understand you correctly to say that if what he was doing was a public act, that would not have been okay?
That's right.
Wouldn't taking the king to his temple or whatever he went to be considered fairly public?
No, that's where you missed the point. Kiddush Hashem can only be in front of Jews. If there are no Jews in that temple, it doesn't matter how many Gentiles they are, that's not called public. For the definition of Kiddush Hashem.
Okay, so you were using the definition of public to mean public in a Jewish environment.
Yeah, I thought I said that, okay.
I'm sorry, Mr. Stephanie.
Yes.
Second, is there a difference in halacha between when death is determined by Jewish law for a Jewish person versus when death occurs for a Noahide that might affect that question of whether a heart transplant is acceptable or not?
I don't see why there should be. Doesn't make sense that there should be a difference. Death is, we define sunset at a certain time for prayer purposes. It's still going to be the same time for some other purpose that you might have for it. It's still going to be the same time. So if death is defined as cessation of breathing, then that's going to be the definition. You see, the question that has come up organ transplantation is a very, very touchy issue. For a long time, Orthodox Jews did not accept organ transplantation. So that became something of, even you could say, a desecration of God's name to an extent, because our word is getting out. We're willing to accept other people's organs, but we're not willing to give up our own. To avoid this Chilul Hashem, there's a large group of rabbis worked towards redefining some issues and finding a way to allow donor transplantation even from Orthodox Jews. And you might even see there's ads being run in certain newspapers of well-known rabbis saying, I'm a card carrier. And you see him standing there holding the card. The card says that I'm an organ donor. So part of this has been in order to, because science has moved so rapidly down the road of organ transplantations being run-of-the-mill, happening all the time, even heart transplants even happens now. So in the same way that the willingness to give organs has become more acceptable than it used to be, the definition of death has also begun to change. There was a time when no one in the Jewish world accepted brain stem, lack of function of brain stem as being death. Science wanted to go with brain stem. Jewish law didn't accept that. There is a group within Orthodox Judaism which is saying that we can accept that. It's a big fight. It's a big argument. It hasn't yet been resolved. The argument there of Moshe Feinstein was unclear. His son-in-law, Rabbi Tandler, Dr. Tandler, he says he understood from his father-in-law that he did allow brainstem death. Others say that no, that isn't what he meant. So that's an issue that has not yet been totally resolved. But the desire to resolve it, meeting science, is understood, and that would perhaps let me go within that. Perhaps to answer your question, then maybe there is a distinction. In other words, the Jew has to be more strict, and he'll say, "I want to define death according to all the opinions, not just according to some opinions." The Noahide can say, "I'm happy to accept the minority opinions for my definition of death. And if the doctors are willing to take the heart out of this individual after his brainstem has ceased to function, the doctor is saying he's dead. A minority of Jewish rabbis also say that he's dead. Good enough for me. Give me the heart." Whereas the Jew might want to say, "No, not good enough for me. I'd rather wait the extra couple of minutes." Yes.
Why, let's say Naaman was Jewish, if he was going somewhere...
He wasn't.
Well, I know he wasn't. I'm just giving an example.
Yeah, had he been Jewish.
Okay, and so does he have to be witnessed by 10 Jews? In other words, idolatry is idolatry. And so a Jew can go off and perform or do something that was idolatry. And, why does it have to be witnessed by 10 Jews? I don't understand that.
No, not the idolatry that's being witnessed. The giving of his life not to worship the idol. For that to be called a Kiddush Hashem, Jews have to witness his death, not the act of him serving the idol. They have to witness his giving his life not to do it.
Part of that, I don't understand. If he's still a part of helping the king bow down to an idol, then why wouldn't that? I mean, he's obviously seen by God doing it. So I don't understand why there has to be 10
right.
if there's not 10.
We're talking about, you're focusing on the idolatry. That's the commandment that you're thinking about. I'm thinking about a different commandment altogether. The commandment I'm thinking about is called Kiddush HaShem. It happens to be in Naaman's case that idolatry is the issue, that the circumstance that came up. But the aspect of Kiddush HaShem could be any. It doesn't have to be idolatry, it could be something else. Kiddush HaShem can only happen in front of a quorum of Jews. Kiddush HaShem. Idolatry, theft, murder can happen anywhere, in front of anyone. No Jews. It's still going to be idolatry, yes, it'll be idolatry. But there won't be a Kiddush HaShem involved unless there are Jews witnessing what happens.
Okay, this I understand.
You get it? Still not clear?
Unless the Jews witness him dying.
Right.
Instead of
In this case, Naaman did not give his life. He did not give his life. So the question in the Talmud was he required to? Was he right not to have given his life? And the Talmud says, yes, he was right. Because if he had given his life, it still would not have been a Kiddush HaShem. Because there wouldn't have been Jews to witness it. So therefore, there's no point in giving his life.
But I don't understand why Elisha said that was all right for him to go back and do that.
Because you don't have to surrender your life not to commit the sin if Jews won't witness the surrender of your life. Had it been a temple in Israel that he was going to, where there are also Jews there all the time, then it would have been a different story. But he's going to a pagan temple where no Jews are going to be present at all. All right. We'll give the lady a time.
okay. So back to the transplant thing. Where does kosher apply in transplant? If you're Jewish and you eat kosher, they're transplanting organs off of mice and pigs, and would that be wrong? Would it be wrong for me if I ate kosher?
No, there's no problem on taking parts of non-kosher animals and putting them into human beings.
There is not?
No, not at all. You can wear pigskin shoes.
No.
You can put a pig's valve into your heart. You only aren't allowed to eat it. If you can find a way to inject bacon into yourself, that really would be okay too. You only aren't allowed to eat it. It's what the Talmud refers to as the pleasure of the throat. The pleasure of the food going sliding down is the problem. So, in fact, even
Okay.
if you really want to do it,
No,
sure.
me. I don't.
No, but it's okay. You only aren't allowed to eat. You only can't eat the pig. You can absorb it in other ways. Yes. Hey, Jack.
Back to the sanctification. What you're saying is, if I understand it correctly, is that only Israel is required in sanctification and ain't based on the text in Leviticus.
Well, that's correct. No. That's not correct. Based on that verse in Leviticus is that a Kiddush HaShem can only happen in the presence of Jews. A non-Jew can still be performing the Kiddush HaShem if he does it in the presence of Jews.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
That was, I think, the problem of his misunderstanding.
Okay, so
Is that it's whether you do it in front of a quorum of Jews or whether you do not, because that can only happen within the Jewish, if you have 10 Jews or witnesses.
that's what it says, yes. Back to Mr. Taylor.
So then, two follow-ups. That would mean that if a Jewish person is in a position to give their life for one of these, and there are 10 Jewish people watching, that they are commanded to do so because it's Kiddush HaShem. But if it were a non-Jewish person who had to do the sin, even if the 10 Jewish people are standing there, they are not commanded to do a Kiddush HaShem. Is that correct?
That's the question. That's the question the Talmud's asking. Are they or aren't they? And it doesn't have an answer. It doesn't have an answer. If the answer is that yes, he is commanded to do a Kiddush HaShem in front of the 10 people, then yes, he must give his life. But possibly the Rambam says he doesn't have to. When the Rambam says he's being forced to transgress on pain of death, forced to transgress one of his commandments, it means in front of 10 Jews, and he doesn't have to give his life. That's what the Rambam says.
So the two cases that you cited from the Talmud about the
rabbis climbing into the oven and jumping off the roof?
So presumably there were not 10 Jewish people standing around watching you.
We don't know that. Maybe they were. But the other commentators just don't like those examples anyway, because they say that maybe they did it because they knew they'd be saved. In other words, they were pushing the envelope. The one guy climbing the oven, he knew that if he did this, she would back up. So you can't really prove something from it. They just want to suggest. But since the Talmud brings it as examples of giving life, and besides, there is another principle, which is that, I didn't really want to get into that at the time. We say that if it's at a time, during a period of persecution, when Jews are being forbidden from keeping the commandments, like you aren't allowed to have circumcision, not allowed to study Torah, then we're commanded to give our lives even privately, even if there aren't witnesses, because otherwise it's giving strength to the persecutor. So therefore, so that's a different, it becomes a little bit more complicated. Do we make those distinctions for each individual Jews? What's happening in the world at the time? Is it just a freak person coming over to you and trying to get you to do the sin? Or is it a time when the government is preventing you from doing the mitzvah? So then perhaps you have to give your lives more readily, even if it's in private. Yes?
So that would, when the second temple was destroyed, that would explain what happened there.
It was a time of national persecution, yeah. And you could even, if you wanted to argue with Naaman, when he says, well, the reason I'm bowing down to this idol, I don't really believe it's an idol, so that should excuse me. We know from the story of Hannah and her 7 sons around Hanukkah time that doesn't work, because the littlest one, remember the king said, let me throw my ring onto the ground, you go pick up my ring, it looks like you're bowing to the idol, that's what people think, but you and I know that you're only bending down to pick up the ring. And the little boy said that he wouldn't do that, and he died. You can't even give the impression of idolatry. Anything else? Good, well then we can wrap it up. Thank you.